Hey guys, Jake Mars is here. I wanted to make just a real quick video about Y-DNA haplogroup J2b L283 and 4 J2b L283 ancient DNA samples that have popped up over the last year or so. And I'll try to make it as brief as possible. Hopefully I can keep it under about 25, maybe 30 minutes, and just try to pop through some slides here real quick. So to cut to the chase, the 4 samples in question from oldest to youngest are samples Z01002 dated to 3900 BCE. That is C14 dated, and that's an early / pre-Yamnaya sample from Zolotarevka, Russia on the Manich steppe. Second sample is sample I-10206. That is dated to, ranged out to 2900 to about 2500 BCE. We'll call it 2700 BCE, just to call it simple, make it simple. And that is a Yamnaya sample from Krihanavik. I believe that's the correct way to pronounce it. Krihanavik, Moldova, which is in southwestern Moldova. Next sample is CGG2103750, ranged out 2600 to 2200 BCE, calling it 2400 BCE here. Again, Yamnaya sample. That one's from Konstantinovka, Moldova, which is over on the other side of Moldova on the border with Ukraine in southeastern Moldova. And that sample also has a twin brother who's buried with him in the same kurgan, and that's sample CGG2103753. Those papers, respectively, the first one from Zolotarevka, that paper was called The Rise and Transformation of Bronze Age Pastoralists in the Caucasus. That has already been published. The next one, the first Yamnaya sample out of Moldova from Krihanavik, that was from The Genetic Origins of the Indo-Europeans. Lead author there, Joseph Lazaridis. And then the 2 samples that came from, or come from, Konstantinovka, Moldova, those are from a paper that's currently in preprint. Lead author there, I believe the last name is pronounced Yediye, and the title of that paper is Ancient Genomics Support Deep Divergence Between Eastern and Western Mediterranean Indo-European Languages. I'm using here the ancient J2b L283 DNA map that's maintained by J2b L283 researcher Flor Vesely. It is a great go-to source for people interested in obviously learning more about the location of these ancient J2b L283 samples, and also learning a little bit more about the papers. There's links to the papers that Flor puts there, as well as the GPS coordinates for the respective burial sites. So really good data that you can click on the fly, and it's been a great tool. So I definitely appreciate Flor keeping that up to date and maintained for those of us who like to use it. But anyhow, this sample, first one here, is Z01002. That's Zolotarevka, Russia, early / pre-Yamnaya. It is out there in the heart of the Manich steppe, which is the portion of the Pontic-Caspian steppe that's due north of the Caucasus Mountains and kind of extends up towards the lower Volga to the east, northeast, and then to the west, northwest. It works its way up pretty close to the lower Don on the border with Ukraine. This is the detailed description of the burial in question, Z01002. Just to read the specifics here for that, that was Kurgan 26, grave 4. Context information: grave 4 is the initial grave and located in the center of the mound. It is a single inhumation in a crouched position on its left side with the head to the west. The grave pit is round, oval, and was covered by stone slabs. Skeleton is covered by red ochre, and below the skeleton organic matter was found. The burial equipment is a whetstone and a sulfur lump modeled in a round shape. Cultural affiliation and dating atypical, probably early or pre-Yamnaya, and again C14 dated to between 3936 and 3780 BC or BCE. So it's almost 6,000 years old, 5,900 years old roughly, this early / pre-Yamnaya kurgan there on the managed steppe. Here's a good map of the location for J2b. It's just south of the Kuma Manich Depression, which is sort of the remnants of an old spillway that used to connect the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea. And here's a good picture of that spillway. Here they're calling it the Manich Kirch Spillway. I sometimes call it the Kuma Manich Depression, so maybe it could also be called the Kuma Manich Spillway, but Manich Kirch Spillway, obviously you can see it flowing from right to left, east to west into the Black Sea, and I think it probably flowed into the Black Sea where presently we have the Sea of Azov in southeastern Ukraine. That's kind of where the Manich Kirch Spillway entered the Black Sea. And I don't know exactly the dates on this. I think it was like 12,000 plus years ago. I'm not exactly sure on that. And I really didn't know anything about this until I started reading up on these ancient Eneolithic steppe samples from the Manich steppe. And that's where I first heard about this spillway. Kind of interesting. Here's the sample. Again, up top, you see the scale, years BC. It's roughly 4,000 BC, just a little bit younger than that, so 5,900. And the sample kind of sits at an intermediate point between samples found in the Caucasus and samples that are found sort of further north and have a more pure, if you will, kind of Eneolithic steppe or steppe profile. This is sort of an intermediary between Caucasus Eneolithic and steppe Eneolithic in terms of the autosomal DNA of the sample. And that's what this chart is for. You can see there towards the middle there, late steppe Eneolithic outlier. That is sample Z01002. And you can see 45% steppe Eneolithic and 55% Caucasus Eneolithic. Late steppe Eneolithic is dated to about 4,200 BCE, which is when it formed. So my suspicion is that J2b L283 has been out there on the Kuma Manich steppe, or the Manich steppe, at least since 4,200 BCE. And then the two contributing streams of ancient DNA that contributed, as previously mentioned, steppe Eneolithic and Caucasus Eneolithic. Caucasus Eneolithic looks like it goes back to about 5,000, maybe 4,800 BCE. And steppe Eneolithic looks like they've got that set at about 4,500 BCE. So it could have a more ancient presence out there on the Manich steppe, just on the basis of the estimated ages of those two contributing sort of ancestry streams to this Z01002 sample. Here's a cline. Basically, it sits in the middle of a cline. It's very similar to that first chart. It sort of sits in between at the bottom there in the brown sort of squares. Those are South Caucasus farmers, probably something similar, I think, to the Akhnashian people from Georgia who tie back to the Shuleveri Shomu culture. And then working your way up, you eventually hit some Maycop, and you got J2b L283 Z01002 in the middle, and then you've got some light green / sort of other aquamarine blue shapes on that cline, and those are samples that are more shifted towards the Eneolithic steppe, not quite as rich with Caucasus Eneolithic ancestry. And I think it works its way all the way up into those purple squares. That's, I want to say, something like Western Siberian hunter-gatherer, or WSHG / bowtie ancestry. So anyhow, there's the note there, late steppe Eneolithic, J2b L283, intermediate point, and I've got the CLV cline in quotes there. That's what I've added to that slide from the paper. And this next slide here, this is the Caucasus Lower Volga area. This comes from the Genetic Origins of the Indo-Europeans paper that came out in preprint about a year ago to the day, April 2024. That was where we got our first J2b L283 sample from Kryhanovik, Moldova. But anyhow, this Caucasus Lower Volga cline, if you look at the area 1 there, that is the CLV, or the Caucasus Lower Volga area. Towards the southern extremity, you've got Maykop, as well as Vonyuchka and Progress. The big samples there are obviously Vonyuchka and Progress. In the middle, you've got a sample called Yamnaya, which is sort of the intermediary point or the midpoint on that cline that's created by looking at those samples from south to north. And at the northern extremity, you've got Berezhnovka 2. And again, that's the northernmost periphery of the CLV cline. The significance to the CLV cline is basically, at least according to the genetic origins of Indo-Europeans study, they look at the area 1 there as sort of like a hub. And from this hub branched off 2 different populations. One population went south from the CLV area, the Caucasus Lower Volga area, and went through the Caucasus into what is today Armenia and eastern Turkey. And those people, based on their hypothesis, are the precursors, or represent the movement of the Proto-Indo-Anatolians out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, specifically the CLV cline area of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, through the Caucasus, and again down into Armenia and Anatolia/Turkey, where they have some samples listed there in area number 4 that were positive for various amounts of CLV ancestry in terms of their autosomal ancestry. Some were as low as 10% CLV ancestry. Some had a bunch more, maybe closer to 30% CLV ancestry. So in their estimate, based on sort of probabilistically, or probably, that was the route that they think that the Proto-Indo-Anatolian speakers took to get into what is today Turkey. And then another group from the CLV area, Caucasus Lower Volga area, branched off not to the south but to the west, and these people were critical for the formation of something called core Yamnaya, and the core Yamnaya were thought to have formed between about 3900 and 4100 BCE, with a core Yamnaya founder effect taking place about 500 years later, around 3500 or 3600 BCE. Again, that was between about 4100 and 3900 BCE for core Yamnaya, and I think their contention, based on the Proto-Indo-Anatolian expansion, is that this would have occurred between about 4400 and 4000 BCE, coinciding approximately with when that Indo-Anatolian branch sort of fractured or broke away and went on its own. So that's the significance to that slide. It's obviously got some ancestry breakdowns on the far right side in terms of the autosomal contributions to those different groups. Yamnaya is very interesting because Zolotarevka was not published at the time of the genetic origins of the Indo-European paper, but Yamnaya and Zolotarevka are essentially the same thing. They're very, very similar genetically. Yamnaya is from a different lineage, R1b V1636 versus J2b L283, obviously for Zolotarevka, but that source ancestry was thought to be very important for both the Proto-Indo-Anatolians to the south, as if those in fact are the Proto-Indo-Anatolians, that's up for debate still, I think, as well as the formation for the core Yamnaya, who had 80% CLV ancestry, but more specifically the core Yamnaya had about 25% ancestry specifically from people like Yamnaya and Zolotarevka in terms of their autosomal DNA. So they were very important for the formation of this core Yamnaya. And again, just reviewing, this is from a Professor David Reich presentation in Budapest, Hungary. I believe this was April of last year as well, right around the same time that their preprint for the genetic origins of Indo-Europeans paper came out. Again, the Yamnaya and the red square there, the Yamnaya middle of the CLV cline, again, the middle, the intermediate portion of that cline, mixed with Dnipro hunter-gatherers to form Dnipro cline and people of the Sredny Stig or Sredny Stog culture. The Yamnaya are unadmixed descendants of Sredny Stig people with 80% CLV ancestry, forming genetically between 4100 and 3900 BCE. And then again, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds with the Proto-Indo-Anatolian discussion, but it's got the same box there in blue. South of the Caucasus, CLV migrants mixed with Mesopotamian farmers to contribute to likely Anatolian speakers in the Central Anatolian Bronze Age. I think this is pronounced Kalahoyuk and Ovaran, 2800 to 1500 BCE. An Ovaran individual, in fact, has a large IBD. That's called identity by descent segment shared with Vonyuchka 1. The ancestry was definitely north of the Caucasus. Example here, 30% Maykop, as it had northern hunter-gatherer admixtures. Definitely people coming down from the managed steppe into Turkey / Anatolia at that time or before that. All right, next one. So now we got the ball rolling with J2b L283 out of Zolotarevka, and now we're moving west across the Pontic-Caspian steppe from southern Russia into Ukraine. And that's wave 2 here. We got migration from the intermediate part of the CLV cline. So again, that's Yamnaya in the case of the paper, but you could also use Zolotarevka for the same thing. And the establishment of the core Yamna or core Yamnaya ancestry. In the black box there, we've got core Yamnaya genetic ancestry forming again between 4100 and 3900 BCE. And there's two different options there in terms of how you can arrive at core Yamnaya around that time frame. And that's 26% Yamnaya and 74% Sredny Stog high, subset of Sredny Stig or Sredny Stog. The other option is you have CLV ancestry, 21% Akhnashian Neolithic ancestry. So those are the Akhnashian farmers from the south of the Caucasus who moved through the Caucasus to the north out onto the managed steppe. I've read that this occurred possibly as early as 4500 BCE. So those South Caucasian Akhnashian farmers or descendants of those farmers were there around that time, mid 5th millennium BCE. You have the Akhnashian Neolithic, and then 57% BP group, that's Berezhnovka Progress. And then you've got Dnipro Don ancestry, 23% GK2. I believe that's Golubaya Krynica, which is a site in Ukraine. So those are your two options to form core Yamnaya. And the lesson here is that you can't have a fully formed Yamnaya individual out on the managed steppe. You have to have those pre-Yamnaya CLV managed steppe people move west first, and they have to cross the lower Don, or they have to be in the vicinity of the lower Don, where they're going to admix with people with Ukrainian Neolithic hunter-gatherer or Ukrainian Neolithic ancestry. That's the final component that's critical for the formation of this core Yamnaya. Again, we have a box here, number 7. This area of the managed steppe is known as Koisugia. There's a archaeological site on the lower Don, just south of Rostov-on-the-Don, called Koisug. And the reason I threw this up here is that Koisug burial complex on the lower Don is thought to be very similar, or at least the Zolotarevka Z01002 burial is thought to be very similar to the Koisug burials there in Koisug or in Koisugia. And so I included this here. This is a kind of a Russian thing that the Russian archaeologists have. I can't find any information on Koisug or Koisugia or that terminology used by any of that sort of Western scientists, anthropologists, archaeologists, whatnot. So that's more of a Russian thing. But that area is known as Koisugia. It's basically the Western Manich steppe approaching the lower Don. And I think that Koisug area would probably be a pretty good area for J2b L283 to have crossed on its westward movement across the Pontic-Caspian steppe. And it's also dated, Koisug burial ground is dated very similarly to that 4100 to 3900 BCE estimated window for when core Yamnaya is thought to have formed. So that's why I threw that up there for the Koisug. All right, here's, now we're going across Ukraine. We're all the way over in Moldova now, the sample I-10206. This one is not C14 dated, so 2900 to 2500 BCE. Krihanovik is the location for that burial, and on the map there, that's the balloon that's highlighted towards the southwestern portion of Moldova, very close to the border with Romania. Just looking at the description of the kurgan here for I-10-206, it was deduced that the deceased was originally placed at the bottom of the pit with the head oriented to the east. Traces from the plant layer covering the pit bottom were found near and beneath the skeleton. Grave goods, a flint arrowhead of elongated triangular shape with slightly convex sides and concave base. And it just goes into the dimensions on the arrowhead. The skeleton, lacking anatomical connection, is incomplete and poorly preserved. Traces of bright red ochre were identified on all its elements, particularly intense on the skull. Other taponomic changes observed include cracking, exfoliation, aerial weathering, and marks left behind by rodent teeth. Anthropological sex male, molecular sex male with an unusual Y haplogroup J2b L283. Biological age at death was about 30 years, so young adult. Pathologies, supragingival calculus, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, active parodic hyperostosis, or cribra crani. Again, I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly. The skeleton is very robust with extremely pronounced muscle insertions with extensive and endosopathic changes on the humerus and the femurs. The individual exhibits a very large skeletal stature, at least 1.81 meters or 181 centimeters tall. Traumas, perimortem fracture in the middle third of the right clavicle. The burial must be attributed to Cernavodă 1 or Yamnaya. The reason they're talking or mentioned in Cernavodă 1 for this particular burial, reading up on the specifics, it was a Yamnaya burial with Yamnaya people buried above him. And so since he's in the bottom of the kurgan, they were deducing that it was the oldest burial, and they thought it was a different archaeological culture or group that was responsible for his burial, and so they wanted something older than Yamnaya, and so they speculated that it would be Cernavodă or Cernavodă 1. But when they sequenced the DNA, it turned out that this particular sample was 84% Core Yamnaya, which is not possible for someone who would have belonged to the Cernavodă or Cernavodă 1 culture. And then also the skeleton remains were found to be scattered in different areas of the pit and at different depths. They had deduced that this grave had been disturbed in ancient times, and perhaps there were more grave goods in the grave at one time, and maybe someone who was a grave robber took some of those goods out of the grave. That's the only thing I can think of as to why they would be messing around with that burial. So anyhow, that's I-10-206 Krihanovik. There is this interesting page that I came across in the Horse, the Wheel, and Language book by Professor David Anthony. It talks about rates of anemia amongst the Yamnaya. And going back to this I-10-206 sample, it mentions that he has cribra crani, which is this active parodic hyperostosis, which is associated with anemia. So this individual was anemic. And as it turns out, anemia was actually quite common amongst the Yamnaya, in large part because they consumed a lot of dairy foods or dairy-based products, which increased susceptibility to anemia. And there was this interesting page that has this graph. It's got some Neolithic steppe samples. It's got, looks like Poltavka, Potapovka, and Srubnaya. So other steppe sort of Yamnaya derived groups, but the main Yamnaya shows roughly a rate of 40% or more in terms of anemia. So anemia was very common, and that was because of their dairy consumption. And that's probably part of the reason why this guy was pretty tall. At 1.81 meters tall, he's just about 6 feet tall, which is a little bit above average height, I think, for a Yamnaya guy around 2900 BCE. And that probably had a little bit to do with dairy consumption. I saw this slide from the same presentation that took place in Budapest from a professor named Denis Topal, T-O-P-A-L. He's from Moldova. He was talking about grave inventory amongst the Yamnaya. He had this interesting slide regarding weapons. As it turns out, the Yamnaya were very rarely buried with any sort of weapons. So it's not something that was common. So even something like an arrowhead is actually kind of unusual. And so looking at the chart there, he's obviously got the Prut River, which was very close to where our Krhana-Vik I-10-206 sample came from, and that shows about a 2.5% of graves from that area have some sort of weapon found in the grave. So it's extremely rare, and really across the board, no matter where you go, it's unusual. There are some areas where maybe 10%, 12.5% of Yamnaya graves have some sort of weapon, but that's the maximum amount, and that's elsewhere on the steppe, not there in Moldova. Arrowheads came in number 2 behind daggers as the second most common weapon to be buried with. Getting back to the core Yamnaya discussion, so I thought this slide was very interesting from the genetic origins of the Indo-European study. It talks about the core Yamnaya founder event, and I'll read it. That's highlighted, but it says Figure 5 shows the results separately analyzed for core Yamnaya dating to the first 300 years of our sampling, 25 samples, to produce a 95% confidence interval between 3829 and 3374 BCE for the time before growth, and 3642 to 3145 BCE for core Yamnaya groups from the later 300 years, 26 samples. In both cases, these correspond to growth from an effective number of reproducing individuals of a few thousand people. So it started out a really small group of guys and gals. These intervals overlap at 3642 to 3374 BCE, corresponding to the late Srednji Stog period. Taken together with the admixture dating, these findings point to a scenario where Srednji Stog were largely formed by admixture before 4000 BCE, likely somewhere within the geographic span of the Dnipro-Don-Klein. Half a millennium later, basically 500 years later, or 3500 BCE, a subgroup of them developed cultural innovations that allowed them to expand dramatically, manifesting in a way that can be detected in the archaeological record around 3300 BCE in both the Pontic and Caspian steppes. So that's just a bunch of guys having a bunch of sons, having a bunch of sons. This starts happening right around 3700, maybe 3650 BCE, and it extends through about 3350 BCE, so this lasts for about 350, 400 years. A good example of this is R1b Z2103, which has a lot of branches spinning off around 3400 BCE. So it had a very successful founder event towards the tail end of this founder event window. J2b L283 is a little bit different in that the oldest branches under J2b L283 tend to be around 3600 and 3500 BCE in terms of their formation dates, and their TMRCA is their time of most recent common ancestor. So in my personal opinion, because J2b L283 started out in the managed steppe exactly where it needed to be at the right time to create core Yamnaya, and because J2b L283 has already been found further west in the western Yamnaya here in Moldova, these 3500 and 3600 BCE dated branches under J2b L283 to me just represent a very early founder event within core Yamnaya, and it was about 100 to 200 years earlier than the core Yamnaya founder event that saw R1b Z2103 become such a successful Yamnaya lineage that was obviously spread all the way out to the east to the Altai Mountains in Mongolia, and obviously all the way out to the west in the Pannonian Plain or the Pannonian Steppe of Hungary. So that was a good example of a very successful lineage towards the tail end of the core Yamnaya founder event. And then here we go. This slide here talks about core Yamnaya plus European farmer descendants. So sample I-10-206 was 84% core Yamnaya ancestry, but it also had about 16% farmer or early European farmer EEF ancestry. And that ancestry had one of three options. It could be tel unit site from Bulgaria, it could be globular amphora culture, which is further north from that sample, or it could be Trypillian ancestry. And the Trypillians had a big presence in that area of Moldova where this Krhana-Vik sample comes from. So there's no question that the 16% farmer ancestry, even though it might say tel unit site on there. There's a note here that says EBA, or early Bronze Age Yamna individuals from Bulgaria, Moldova, and Ukraine, included unadmixed core Yamnaya as well as others with European farmer ancestry. The source of the farmer ancestry could be Tripilia or Globula amphora, and is unclear. So it's one of those two, in my opinion. It's probably Tripilian ancestry. And the significance to this movement into Moldova and then into Romania, where these Yamnaya samples begin to show more and more early European farmer ancestry, is it's believed that that's where language transmission is taking place. And so that's where the language is being passed down from one group who might be settling down, having children with local people, and that language is then sort of passed down. You gotta have a family with these people and have kids to pass on the language. If you don't reproduce with the local population, then you're never going to transmit that language. That EEF, or early European farmer admixture there in southeastern Europe with the Yamnaya, is thought to be very important for this language transmission. The burial in Krhanovik, the Genetic Origins of Indo-Europeans paper speculates that the core Yamnaya founder event may have occurred in the Mikhailovka culture, which is on the lower Dnipro River in southern Ukraine. That's why it's referred to as the Dnipro Climb. For that core Yamnaya founder event around 3500 BCE. It's not proven that that's where it occurred, but that's the hypothesis based on the data, is that it was likely very near there. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I do think it's relevant to haplogroup J2b, L283, because there's a group called the lower Mikhailovka culture, and they're dated to about 3600 to 3500 BCE, which corresponds with the 3600, 3500 BCE early core Yamnaya founder event branches for J2b, L283. So I think that group, lower Yamnaya, is certainly a reasonable group to think about. And then there's another group that seems to be nearby, and they have kurgans and burials that appear to be interspersed somewhat with the lower Mikhailovka group, and that's called the Kvityana culture. And they are dated very similar, I think 3700, 3600, 3500 BCE, and maybe even a little bit later. A little bit later than that. And both of those groups, lower Mikhailovka / Kvityana, are referred to as late Sredny Stog or post Stog groups, which, based on the Genetic Origins of Indo-Europeans paper, they posit that core Yamnaya comes from these some sort of post Stog group. So I think those are two great candidate cultures. And then, interestingly enough, there are Kvityana burials to the southwest of the lower Dnipro, right there in Moldova, near where this J2b, L283 Krhanovik sample comes from. So he might have some ties potentially to Kvityana, or obviously lower Mikhailovka. There's virtually no ancient DNA samples from this part of the world still to this day. We don't have any 34, 35, 3600 BCE male line Yamnaya samples, so that's a huge hole in terms of sampling. And again, here's the note on the Kvityana. It's got a note: the formation of Kvityana culture should be considered both in the context of the development of the lower Mikhailovka culture and in terms of the influence of the Sredny Stog II pottery assemblage. The first is manifested in the development of the kurgan ritual itself, with such structural elements as cromlechs, orthostats, and stone cists. These are most apparent to the south in the zone of contact with the lower Mikhailovka culture. The second is apparent in the similarity between Kvityana pottery and Sredny Stog II pottery, notably in a number of shared compositional and technical elements, despite the fact that the shapes, techniques, and style are all quite different. As a whole, the Kvityana culture is notably conservative and archaic in appearance. This is manifest both in the preservation of a burial rite involving a supine position and in the appearance of the pottery, which, on the basis of the absence of corded or caterpillar track decoration, was until recently considered the earliest Sredny Stog ware. So that's Kvityana. So yeah, Kvityana / lower Mikhailovka, that would be a great, one possibility. So last two samples here, 103750 and 103753. These are twin Yamnaya brothers from the Konstantinovka Kurgan and Konstantinovka, Moldova. Again, that's in southeastern Moldova on the border with Ukraine. Those date between 2600 and 2200 BCE, so not C14 dated. So called it 2400 BCE. And most significant aspect, or one of the significant aspects of this burial, is that this individual, or these individuals, tested positive for the Z597 branch of J2b L283. Almost all of us who trace our ancestry back to Europe who are J2b L283 come from the Z597 branch. Almost all of us. There are a few J2b L283 guys who do not descend from that branch, but the vast majority of us do. So it's really cool to see him, see this guy pop up there on the border with Ukraine and Moldova, and it definitely hints towards that being very close to the likely origin of that branch. And it makes sense because the Yamnaya started moving into the Balkans around 3000 BCE, and Z597 has a formation date estimated of about 3000 BCE and a TMRCA of 2500 BCE, and those two dates coincide very closely with the early as well as late migrations of the Yamnaya into the Balkans. Then again, looking at the specifics on this one, grave, this would be grave burial 8 for the main sample. Kurgan 1, grave 8, Yamnaya culture, probably late, archaeologically dated to 2600, 2200 BCE. Grave 8 is a secondary burial and was identified in the southwestern sector of the mound. It was trapezoidal in shape, northwest/southeast oriented. The bottom of the burial pit was covered by dark brown decay/rot. The body was laid on his back and inclined on his left side, crouched position on the back, inclined on the left. Skull to the northwest, legs strongly crouched on its left side, arms slightly bent towards the pelvis. The bones, and especially the skull and the left arm, were deep red stained with ochre. They used a tooth sample or a molar sample. Anthropological determination, male, age 55 to 70. So this is a pretty old-ass Yamnaya guy. 55 to 70 back in those days was a pretty long life. And again, there's just the location of this Konstantinovka burial there in southeastern Moldova on the border with Ukraine. That entire area there in that slide is known as the Budjak or Budjak steppe, and so consequently Yamnaya people from that area of Moldova are just referred to frequently as Budjak or Budjak Yamnaya. This particular paper where I saw this slide, they date the Budjak Yamnaya between 3100 and 2200 BCE. So pretty interesting. It's about eight or 900 years history there, just there in Yamnaya, with the Yamnaya in Moldova. So Moldova was a very important stop for the Yamnaya, and if you're coming out of Ukraine going to the Balkans like J2b L283 did, you're going to have to go through Moldova and the Budjak Yamnaya. There's no other way to slice it and dice it, so that's why we're connected with the Budjak Yamnaya, just because of the route. Again, there's Konstantinovka highlighted as being a Budjak burial. Here's a slide, again, looking at the autosomal DNA for sample 103750. Again, they've got it dated to 4,500 years ago, about 2,500 BCE, and 100% Yamnaya ancestry in terms of the autosomal qualities of that individual. And here we got this is a slide that I thought was kind of interesting. I'm not a linguist, obviously. I don't understand a lot about linguistics. But the significance to the core Yamnaya, what makes the core Yamnaya unique, is that they are thought to have been responsible for language transmission. And there's 3 languages that track directly back to the Yamnaya, and they are Albanian, Armenian, and Greek. And so these are sort of the languages of late Yamnaya. And getting back to Ukraine real quick, so you had different types of Yamnaya. You had core Yamnaya, but you also had the Don Yamnaya. The Don Yamnaya were Yamnaya, but they were different. They didn't undergo the core Yamnaya founder event, so there was no diversification of the lineages of the haplogroups found along the Don. So they were less mobile, they weren't moving about. The core Yamnaya were different, they were moving around, and so this language probably formed somewhere there around Moldova. These languages, Albanian, Greek, and Armenian. It must have been somewhere around Moldova or Western Ukraine, and then these guys branched off and went their own ways, and that's how you can explain Armenians being grouped with Albanians and Greeks. And then the other test is obviously if you have a lineage that's a core Yamnaya lineage, you would look then to these countries and these places to see if you find those core Yamnaya lineages found amongst not just the people living today, but also the ancient DNA samples. And that's certainly the case with R1b Z2103, but it's also the case with J2b L283 as well, where you have good representation of that lineage found amongst modern day Albanians, as well as ancient samples from Albania, from Montenegro, from Croatia. You have J2b L283 ancient DNA samples from Mycenaean Greece, from a couple different sites down there, and under branches that were no question connected with the Yamnaya. Z615 is one branch, 3100 BCE formation date on that one, and I think the other most recent sample came from Kirha, Greece. That was under the Z600 branch, and that's a 3500 BCE formation date. So that one might track all the way back directly to south central Ukraine, that branch in Kirha. And then we now have R1b Z2103 found amongst the Mycenaean Greeks, and obviously R1b Z2103 is very well represented amongst the Armenians. I don't know off the top of my head, maybe 20-25% of all Armenian men come from the Z2103 branch. J2b L283 is very rare out there. There was one ancient J2b L283 sample called Rise 408, and that guy came from eastern Armenia, from a site called Norabak, and that individual belonged to the Lachashan Metsamor culture, which is thought to have been associated with early Armenian people. And then also there's Illyrian in there. I don't know anything about the Illyrian language, so it seems to be obviously connected with Albanian in some way, but we don't have any great examples of that I'm aware of the actual Illyrian language. So, and I just don't know enough about it to say anything about it beyond that. Here's a good example. This is a late Yamnaya / catacomb man. I think that he is from Ukraine somewhere, and this was done by, I believe the user's name or the individual's name goes by the name Ancestral Whisper or Ancestral Whispers, and he does these really cool reconstruction of human skulls that have been found in some of these Kurgan burials. I think he maybe uses some sort of program or artificial intelligence, but he kind of reconstructs what the guy might have looked like using the skull and the features of the skull. So I thought this guy was really kind of jumped out at me a little bit. So this is a catacomb / late Yamnaya individual, and I think that our J2b L283 haplogroup is probably connected with these guys as well. So that's it. Special shout out, big thanks to both Hunter Provin and Flor Vesely for all their help and assistance and mentoring over the years. I've used those two guys. They're obviously very well-known Haplogroup J2b L283 researchers. I mentioned Flor already with the ancient DNA map. That's a great tool that I've used for many years. If I need to find a shortcut to get to a paper, I usually use his map. Click on the link that pops up, and that takes me directly to the paper. And with Hunter, I've always used Hunter Provin YouTube channel to watch his videos, to learn as much as I can about our collective J2b L283 lineage. And I also use his phylogeographer.com website. Occasionally he's got some great articles there about J2b L283, but also a lot of other Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA lineages and various different groups of people around the world. It's a really fascinating site, and I've learned a lot from it, and I've learned a lot from those two guys. So again, thank you very much, Flor, and thank you very much, Hunter, for everything that you've taught me over the years. Thank you.